You're listening to the Vocabbett podcast, where I help students improve their vocabulary for the SAT, ACT, and life itself using my unique and research-backed story-based method. On this podcast, I'm sharing the best tips and tricks for a more enriched vocabulary and pain-free test day. Hello, and welcome to episode number 23 of the Vocabbett podcast. I'm Erica Abbott, a former English and history teacher, the author of the young adult novel Ahead of Her Time, and the founder of the eponymously named vocabulary company, Vocabbett. So with it being June now and schools recently ending or about to end, depending on where you live, a pretty understandable question is, what will schools look like when we get back in the fall? It's safe to say no one really knows yet. There are a couple of recurring themes when you read the articles and talk to people. There will probably be more time spent outside, weather permitting, more family-style dining because cafeterias are obviously high contact points. Maybe even some hybrid learning where kids alternate which day of the week they physically go to school in order to accommodate CDC guidelines. But the way I see it, all of these changes are just circumstantial modifications to a system that, quite frankly, could do with a much larger overhaul. They're a new coat of paint on an old crumbling house. It might help you keep up with the latest trends, but it's not going to actually fix anything. And during this time of change, I think we have a responsibility to open up some of the walls, so to speak, and really examine what's working and what isn't. So let's start here. Our current model, where a group of kids who all live in roughly the same geographic area learn from a teacher who is also from the same approximate geographic area, this is a model that was used in Little House on the Prairie. It has not evolved commensurate with the rest of society. Yes, we have made tweaks over time, just like we are now. We've incorporated computers and things like that, but the structure itself remains largely unchanged. Kids who live relatively close to each other are still grouped together, being educated by a teacher who lives relatively close to them. To highlight the discrepancy here, how little our education system has evolved compared to the rest of society, think of it like this. If you transported me back to the Little House on the Prairie days, I honestly don't know if I would last a week. I have no idea how to grow my own food. I'm pretty sure if I actually had to ride a horse that wasn't, walking around in circles on a summer camp, if I actually had to ride a horse anywhere, I would fall off and break my leg in 2 seconds. And to top it all off, I'd probably be considered far too uppity for a woman. I would probably tick off some town elder and get myself scarlet lettered or something. I wouldn't last long. But there is one place where I would probably be fine, and that's the schoolhouse. I can sit in a classroom and repeat what a teacher's saying. I've got a lot of experience with that. There would be some differences, but I really don't think it would faze me too much to see the teacher writing in chalk. I'm more used to expo markers, but I'd be able to handle it. Compared to the rest of the societal changes that I would be facing, the schoolhouse would probably feel surprisingly familiar. And that's because we're still using that same model today. Kids who live in roughly the same geographic place are all grouped together learning the same thing from a teacher who lives in roughly the same geographic area. I think for younger kids who are learning more soft skills, how to share, things like that, the system is actually pretty good. And I think that that's partially because, let's call it the lower school with our, building in fresh coats of paint analogy. The lower school actually got some pretty big renovations in the 1900s with Maria Montessori. Even if you don't go to a Montessori school, Maria Montessori really changed everything for young children. It's largely because of her that we have child-sized things, that kids do more exploratory learning, more learning with their hands. Even outside of Montessori schools, we've really adopted a lot of her principles and changed our collective education system for that group. So I think the system really actually isn't terrible for young kids, but of course, I'm always looking for ways to make things better. But for the rest of this podcast, I want to focus on high school. As our kids age, I think that this system serves them less and less, and I think that that's true at all ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. Let's say you or your kids go to a private school, an independent school, whatever you want to call it, a school where you're paying tuition. And remember, we're talking about high school now. A lot of these schools charge $30,000 a year per kid. And let's say your kid's being bullied. I personally went to a school like this. My nickname growing up with my family was Ika. The kids at school called me Iki the Freaky Geeky. A kid hawked a loogie on my backpack, and I had to do my best to wipe it off and then carry around my bag smeared with snot for the rest of the day. I often sat by myself and did homework through lunch because I didn't have anyone to sit with. And maybe that's just part of growing up. Maybe it's just a rite of passage, but maybe not. And if it were me, I might not be overly excited to go back to that when school starts up in the fall, especially considering you are paying a small fortune to have these things happen to you. Or let's say you're not being bullied, you just want to have the best life you can. I can't help but wonder if you or your parents aren't thinking, how much more could we be getting for this amount of time and money? There is so much wasted time under the current model. Between the commute, hanging around waiting for school to start, the 5 to 10 minutes you spend every hour just for passing periods, the time you spend in advisory or homeroom, let's just be honest, killing time, having to listen to the teacher ask someone to be quiet for the 400th time. All of this is time that could be better spent. How different would your life look if you got to choose what you did with those hours? Maybe you really wouldn't even do anything with them. Maybe you'd just relax and recharge a little, and we would see our societal stress and anxiety levels go down. Or maybe you'd throw yourself into a sport you love, a hobby. If you love writing, you could write a book in this amount of time. You could become the next top chef, whatever. This is a lot of time that we could be doing something with our lives or just recharging. One of the biggest issues with the current model is how much wasted time is built into the system. And that's not anyone's fault. I want this to be really clear. I'm not teacher bashing at all. I used to be a teacher. I love teachers. It's just a fact of the current system. And right now, as a family, you basically have one alternative, and that's homeschooling. Everyone needs to do what's best for their family, but people who are not currently homeschooling often have reasons for not going that route. Maybe both parents work, so no one can stay home and teach the kids. Maybe no one wants to be the teacher, and that's fine. Maybe they're worried about the socialization element, and I know that there are plenty of ways for homeschool kids to be socialized, but these are just some of the things that people talk about. So under the current system, you're kind of left between a rock and a hard place. Neither school nor homeschooling is ideal. Now let's say you're at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum. I won't claim to have a ton of experience on both ends of this, but to give you an idea of my background, I went to a fancy school from 5th grade on. But when I was little, my mom was a single mom. We lived in a tiny little apartment that reeked of cigarettes, and the neighbors would bang on the wall and tell us to be quiet. Things changed when my mom graduated from med school, and then they changed again when she got remarried, and that's when I started going to private school. But I haven't entirely lived in a bubble. So, covering all ends of the spectrum here, let's now say that your kid goes to a not so amazing public school. Maybe your kids are being bullied. Maybe they're in a school that's been termed part of, and this is what it's referred to in the academic literature, part of the school to prison pipeline because of the horrible conditions these kids are expected to learn in and how that often ends up. And to top it off, statistically, a huge percentage of these students graduate not college ready, is what they call it. So if they do graduate, they're literally disadvantaged from step one because they haven't been adequately prepared. It's not a good situation, and especially after last week's episode where we talked about how oppression can only exist when there's an imbalance of power, and these inequities in our education system are one of the biggest enablers of that, we have to not only address the current flaws in our education system, but we really need to be doing everything that we can to change them. So, okay, under the existing model, what's the alternative? Homeschooling. But again, many families who are not already homeschooling probably have their reasons for it. So, no matter where you are in the economic spectrum, what's a family to do? I can't help but wonder if a new type of schooling isn't going to be born out of this. And because everything needs a name, I'm just going to call it sovereign schooling. Sounds fancy like the sovereign, the queen, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see something like this. Let's go back to the tuition families first. I can't help but wonder if groups of these families aren't going to start splintering off and doing their own thing, pooling some or all of the resources they were investing before, and rather than become teachers themselves, use those resources to bring in the best tutors and teachers for certain subjects, and then build a more custom curriculum for whatever they think will be useful with the remaining time. Maybe one of the parents teaches a business workshop or a finance intensive or a cooking class, or they travel to the places that they've been learning about. Maybe they even tell their kids to go get an apprenticeship in whatever industry they're interested in. At my school, we had something called May program, where every May you didn't do traditional classes. You took electives or studied abroad or did an internship, and it was hands down the best part of the year and how a lot of people got their first job. This is part of why I was saying I want to talk about high schoolers right now, because 5-year-olds don't need internships. The needs of a high schooler are different than the needs of an elementary schooler. These sovereign schools, so to speak, would allow families to get the best of both worlds. They'd give you all of the flexibility of homeschooling, but the parents wouldn't have to be the teachers. And the other traditional objections to homeschooling wouldn't be a factor because you'd do it with a cohort. You'd do it with your friends. You'd just have to in order to afford professional help at that same price point. And if you're an educator, some of this might sound alarming. Your schools are losing kids. But I think it would actually be good for educators because the demand for teachers would go up as the student-teacher ratio goes down. And I can only speak for myself. Obviously, not everything is right for everyone. We obviously still need teachers in conventional schools. But I think if you found the right family to do this with, this would actually be so cool. Now, here's the rub. Families at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum can't afford to pay professionals to come in and teach their kids. And it kills me because, and I'm pretty sure every teacher feels this way, I wish I could just clone myself 1,000,000 times and go help every single kid. But at this point, that's not possible. And the next best thing, which is still not enough, but I think it might be better for some families than the existing model, is to do the cohorts. Find a handful of like-minded families who you are going to commit to getting through this period with and adopt a distance learning curriculum. You can take the best courses online now. Quite frankly, your finance intensive might be a TED Talk by the smartest guy in the world, and it might even be better than the finance intensive by the private school parent. If you are just crushing it with this distance learning, which I have no doubt that you will, you can even enroll in Harvard courses online now and be a dual credit student before you turn 18, crushing any questions about the legitimacy of sovereign schooling. You could get out of a bad situation, and thanks to the internet, you can be learning from the smartest people in the world. There is no reason why our existing model, which remember is all geography-based, you learn from someone who you are physically close to. In the era of the internet, there is no reason why you can't be learning from the smartest people in the world, no matter where they are. And if this becomes a thing, people will put together really easy to follow curriculums for it, and they will make it available for free to people who need it. You could learn so much thanks to the power of the internet and get out of a school that isn't serving you. And if there's any justice in the world, we will figure out a way to continue providing the essential services that are currently fulfilled through schools, mainly meals. It would be amazing if we could just really quickly adapt to this and say, okay, all sovereign school families, you do a drive-through pickup from whatever time to whatever time. But I'm very aware that this is a preliminary conversation and there are services that schools currently provide that would need to be addressed. This podcast is getting longer than it normally is, but it would be irresponsible not to point out the other side of this. I've painted a really rosy picture, but there can be unintended consequences with every change. And with something as important as education, this is not a decision that should be made lightly. The parents and the students would both really have to be on board or this wouldn't work. And oh my gosh, I cannot stress this enough. There can be zero financial incentives for this. There will be people who say for school lunches or something like that, oh, a drive-through is too hard. We should just give people a credit or something and let them take care of it. And I hate to go here because obviously the vast majority of parents are good people, but there are also deadbeats out there. I personally come from 2 generations of deadbeat dads. And if you literally pay people to take their kids out of school, there will be parents who do this for the money and don't care at all what their kids do, and their kids will be worse off than before. So you have to be really careful not to create unintended consequences here. And one of the most basic things that you need to agree on from the beginning is you're not going to pay people to take their kids out of school. You have to be really careful about that. The only financial element that I think could be tweaked here, and the teachers' unions would throw a fit, but public schools get a certain amount of money per student. Depending on where you live, it's usually around $10,000 to $20,000 per kid. If those students are no longer enrolled there, I can see decreasing that amount of money to pay for just what the kids are actually using, namely food. But then the rest of those tax dollars could be allocated towards libraries and making high speed internet available in other safe public spaces where these kids could learn. There really aren't that many conversations more important than how to best serve the next generation. We are in the middle of that talk right now as a nation, and I have to admit, I've been a little disappointed not to see more innovative solutions proposed as to how to best move forward. I feel like we're all just tinkering around the edges, slapping a fresh coat of paint on, for the high schoolers at least, a crumbling building. I can't help but wonder if the next trend in education is a little more autonomous. If getting kids out of these schools where they're bullied and anxious and wasting half their day wouldn't be a good idea. They would still spend time with their friends, going to summer camp, all the good parts of life. I'd even suggest these kids study abroad, even if the study abroad puts them in a traditional school setting. I learned more my senior year of high school in Italy than all my years at SMU of college combined. So I don't think these sovereign schools are really all that radical. They're taking the best parts of the current system, traditional schooling, homeschooling, and studying abroad, and combining it. I would really love to know what you think about this. Please, please, please weigh in on Twitter or Instagram or shoot me an email. I'd love to know if this is something you guys would ever consider moving forward, or if you have a better idea, I want to hear it. Let me know what you think. All right, I will see you guys on Tuesday.